Marjorie Taylor Green just kind of went crazy on Twitter the other day. She wrote, "Corporate communists believe they have to force behaviors. They only need to remember as a corporation or business their only job is to serve their customer with the best job possible to make their customers happy. It's not about gender, sex, race, and blah, blah, blah." Now, what she's talking about here is affirmative action, or what used to be called affirmative action. Now it's called diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. And she was attacking Blackstone, the investment firm out of New York City, for having a DEI program. There's an amazing history here, and I'm going to just summarize it quite quickly for you, and that is that John Kennedy started this whole thing, right? John Kennedy first came up with the phrase affirmative action. And in fact, it was part of an executive order demanding that federal agencies take affirmative action to hire people who, specifically black people, more generally minorities that had historically been discriminated against. And he gave this brilliant speech. It was on June 11th, 1963, that John Kennedy gave this speech. And saying, we're confronted today primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. And, he says, we preach freedom around the world, and we mean it, but are we to tell the world that this is the land of the free except for black people? I mean, that was the essence of his speech. Now, Kennedy had proposed the Civil Rights Act, and he didn't live to see it pass Congress. That job fell to Lyndon Johnson in '64, and then the Voting Rights Act in '65. But JFK set the floor for this. So JFK starts this with something called affirmative action. Lyndon Johnson carries it forward even farther, affirmative action. Jimmy Carter comes along, and Nixon was kind of in between on all this stuff, the Nixon presidency. So then comes Jimmy Carter, and he brings it forward again. Hey, let's do affirmative action. And then comes Reagan. And Reagan actively pushed back on this. Reagan's first official campaign stop, of course, was in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where Schwimmer, Goodman, and Cheney were murdered, the three civil rights workers in 1964, and gave a speech on states' rights. Reagan liked to use racist metaphors, including his strapping young buck phrase and his welfare queen phrase. But he didn't just talk about stopping affirmative action. He actually did it. This is from the Washington Post. Quote, in the 1980s, the Reagan administration began to roll back civil rights protections and legally designated targets for affirmative action hires, thus bringing the politics of reverse discrimination to the White House. Under the now familiar banner of Let's Make America Great Again, Reagan campaigned vigorously against affirmative action in 1980, promising voters he would overturn policies that mandated, in his views, quote, federal guidelines or quotas which require race, ethnicity, or sex to be the principal factor in hiring or education, end quote. So here you've got Kennedy, Johnson, Carter advancing civil rights and affirmative action. You've got Reagan reversing it. Reagan's Secretary of Labor, for example, this is also from the Washington Post. Reagan's Secretary of Labor, for example, implemented new federal compliance guidelines that exempted as many as 75% of companies contracting with the federal government from previously mandatory affirmative action programs. But, and also Reagan had hired as chair of his Equal Employment Opportunity Commission a young man by the name of Clarence Thomas, who was also dedicated to dismantling civil rights legislation and affirmative action legislation. He's now, of course, on the Supreme Court. So Reagan backed us, tried to push us back into the 50s. Then Bill Clinton comes in, and Bill Clinton says, no, we're going to restart affirmative action. We're gonna move forward on this. George W. Bush becomes president, and he doesn't go either way. He's arguably the first Republican presidency since, I don't know, since Reconstruction anyway, that didn't use race as a political weapon, frankly. So it kind of, it just kind of stabilized, and then, during the George W. Bush administration. And then comes Obama. Obama says, okay, we're going to go back to affirmative action. And then came Trump, and Trump does the same thing Reagan did. He actually rolls back affirmative action, reverses all these programs. These now, by this point in time, it's no longer called affirmative action. It's called diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity, inclusion, and equity, DIE, inclusion and equity. And so, Trump is running for president again, and his racist base is wildly enthusiastic about this. They hate DEI. They hate affirmative action. They want to see women and black people in particular return back to their second-class status that preceded the civil rights era. And Republican racists proudly lay it all out for everyone to see. I mean, here's Marjorie Taylor Green saying, companies shouldn't be worrying about this stuff. Just serve your customers, right? Like, serving those all-white lunch counters in Georgia. Of course, Marge is from Georgia, so it just makes sense. Anyhow, what is the opposite of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Whites-only communities, whites-only jobs, and racial segregation. And apparently that's what Marjorie Taylor Green and the modern GOP are all about, proudly.